The story of Italy in the Second World War is often dominated by the narrative of their seeming inability to do anything but play second fiddle to the Germans. Consistently desperate to be seen as an equal to his authoritarian Germanic ally, Mussolini was known to make tactical and military decisions purely based on the glory and positive press they would supposedly bring back to him, regardless of whether there was any real strategic value to it. His ill-fated invasion of Greece perhaps being one of the most famous examples. But today, we take a look at an event that predates that looks back to the very early days of the war when the Italians joined the war, and looks at the fledgling operations undertaken by them that served to cement their legacy in World War II. One that, to put it mildly, is not particularly positive. The fall of France was predated by the Italians joining the war by only 12 days. During that time, Mussolini did indeed order some Regia Aeronautica involvement during the closing days of the campaign. Starting on the 13th of June, bomber raids began, often escorted by types such as CR-42s, aircraft that even then would have been very outclassed by modern French fighters like the D-520. Luckily for them, the majority of the attention of the French Air Force was taken up by the Luftwaffe, which posed a much more serious threat. Despite this, in just 12 days of operation, almost a bomber a day was lost to French fighters, which still proved enough of a threat to be a genuine concern to Italian crews. BR-20s made up the majority of losses, being fairly vulnerable and approaching obsolescence even by this point. Italy's involvement during the closing days of the Battle of France had been a fairly transparent attempt at seizing some of the glory for themselves. How successful this play was, I'm happy to leave up to the viewer. However, as I'm sure everyone is aware, the Battle of France was quite rapidly followed by one of the most legendary battles perhaps of all time, the Battle of Britain. Germany's inevitable leading role on the Axis side of this operation was set in stone, but what would eventually become the Corpo Aereo Italiano, effectively an expeditionary force of the Regia Aeronautica, also felt that they had something to say. Comprising 3 stormi, or wings, the Corpo Aereo Italiano, or Italian Air Corps, comprised some 200 aircraft, which Mussolini was more than happy to offer up for the war effort. Through his foreign minister, Count Galeazzo Ciano, Mussolini also offered 10 infantry divisions to Hitler for an expected invasion of the British Isles. Interestingly, this offering was initially refused, with Hitler apparently expecting to achieve air superiority without outside help and unwilling to share any of the credit of the presumed success. Thus, the operation began, early July marking what is generally considered as the starting date. What began as nuisance raids to poke and prod at the RAF later developed into more intense attacks on shipping in the Channel from mid-July until August, which only intensified in the so-called Adlerangriff phase, or Eagle attack, which began on the 13th of August and sought to obliterate RAF presence in southern England, along with massive bombing raids on RAF airfields and night bombing of ports and industrial cities. Italian involvement followed this period, and is essentially a direct result of how hard the fighting became. On just the 18th of August alone, 69 Luftwaffe aircraft were lost. In the fighting, German pilots were just as often captured as they were shot down and killed, whereas RAF pilots, if they managed to bail out, were able to be operational within the same day. Thus, the war of attrition seemed to turn against the Germans, who were losing pilots as well as aircraft at a rate that was unsustainable. At the end of August, the Luftwaffe had lost 670 aircraft, whilst the RAF had lost 400 fighters. Despite the serious issues being caused to the RAF by the concentrated effort to bomb airfields, the Luftwaffe's strategy changed in September towards raiding cities, specifically London. On September 15th, an enormous fleet of over 1,000 aircraft headed for London to be intercepted by around 250 RAF fighters. This single engagement cost the Luftwaffe 60 aircraft and many more crew. It was clear that turning down resources was not a luxury the Germans could afford, and with Mussolini in the background offering up 200 aircraft, the decision was obvious. Hitler's initial response was withdrawn, and the Italians were given the green light to get involved. Thus, on the 10th of September 1940, the Corpo Aereo Italiano was officially created under the command of Air Marshal Rino Corso Fugger. On the 25th and 27th of September, 37 Fiat BR-20 bombers of 43rd Stormo arrived at Chièvre airfield in Belgium, 3 having been lost en route. By the 27th, 60 bombers had made their way from Italy, to be joined by the fighter wing of the CAI 2 weeks later. Once in position and operational, the order of battle stood as follows. The 13th Stormo, comprising 38 BR-20 bombers based at Melsbroek, Belgium, the 43rd Stormo, with 27 BR-20s at Chièvre, with a further 50 Fiat CO-42s and 48 Fiat G-50s to support them. Supporting operations were 5 canned Z-1007s, 12 Caproni CA-133s, and 1 Savoia Marchetti S-75. A further 9 CA-164s were supposedly used for communication, with a single Junkers Ju-52 on loan from Germany to ferry spare parts and supplies between Rome and Belgium. It's worth noting that it had already taken until the end of September for the aircraft to begin to arrive. This meant that they had already missed a pretty critical phase of the battle. After a bitter and tough August, with RAF losses being much higher than either new aircraft being produced or pilots being trained, the 7th of September marked the first day that the British were able to produce more aircraft than they were losing. They would stay above this critical threshold for the remainder of the war. By October, German bombing of British targets and cities was peaking, whilst the pressure against the RAF, in terms of attrition, had been significantly alleviated. The first actual combat sortie by the Italians happened on the 23rd of October, very late to the party indeed. A fairly small number of combat sorties would be undertaken by the CAI between October and January 1941. The initial sortie took place under the cover of night, with 16 BR-20s taking off and bombing Harwich from an altitude of 5,000 meters. No fighter escort was present, as the fighters had not arrived yet, although no bombers were lost in this action. The second action, perhaps hinting at the Italian crew's inexperience with the battle, consisted of a low-altitude daylight raid in close formation on Ramsgate. The slow, brightly decorated Italian bombers apparently shocked the British AA crews with their goal. This perhaps was a genius move, as despite 5 of them being damaged, all but 1 of them made it back to the airfield, with 1 BR-20 being forced to ditch in Belgium. This particular raid succeeded in dropping 75 bombs on Ramsgate, although I can't find a source attesting to their effect. It wasn't until the 5th of November that another raid was launched, this time a night operation against Harwich, consisting of 13 BR-20s targeting civilians. It's interesting to note that English newspapers gave reports of citizens noting a different engine tone than usual, one that sounded like tin cans, suggesting that the Italian engines sounded significantly different, but also suggesting that if the sound of the engine was most noteworthy, not much damage was done. 6 days later, on the 11th, the CAI conducted the raid that perhaps cemented their negative reputation. It was their second and last daytime raid, 10 BR-20s taking off at midday, armed with 3 250-kilogram bombs. At 1440, the bombers were approaching Harwich at 3.7 kilometers of altitude, escorted by 40 CR-42s. The intended escort of BF-109s and G-50s had been forced to return to base due to bad weather. This approach was not unnoticed by British radar, and Hurricanes from 17th and 257 Squadron were scrambled to intercept the formation, whilst Hurricanes from 46 Squadron, already on patrol, were vectored to intercept the encroachers. What followed was later referred to as the Spaghetti Party. Flight Lieutenant Howard Peter Blatchford, squadron leader of 257 Squadron, was the first to make contact, sighting 9 Italian bombers 10 miles or 16 kilometers east of Harwich. Getting stuck in, 1 BR-20 quickly went down after the pilots were presumably incapacitated, another being set alight and going down into the cold sea below. Blatchford then turned his attention to a group of CR-42s, firing upon one and observing damage before being attacked by another. In the vicious melee that followed, he proceeded to ram the upper wing of a hapless CR-42 with his propeller after running out of ammunition. Stricken, the Italian fighter fell away out of sight, whilst Blatchford ultimately made it back to base, albeit missing 8 inches of his propeller. The rest of the propeller being splattered with blood gave a gruesome hint as to what had become of the unfortunate Italian aviator. One CR-42 pilot taking part in this raid, a Sergeant Pietro Salvadori, was left straggling behind after a ruptured oil line meant his engine began to lose power and overheat. Much too far from friendly territory to break off and head back, Salvadori was instead forced to look for a suitable landing spot in England, eventually selecting a flat piece of grass near the Orfordness Lighthouse in Suffolk. Ditching being notoriously difficult with fixed undercarriage, the aircraft nosed over and their propeller struck the ground, although the pilot was unhurt. Noticing a hurricane loitering around, Salvadori was initially concerned about being strafed, but the British pilot merely rocked his wings at the Italian aviator and reported his position. Picked up as a POW, the aircraft was of significant use to the RAF, as the CR-42 was a very common opponent in the Middle East, and having a captured example could help when it came to developing tactics to counter it. Dismantled, transported to RAF Martlesham, and put back together, the CR-42 was painted in RAF colours and evaluated. Thankfully, this particular aircraft was preserved, and is in fact on display to the public at the RAF Museum in London. At 14:30 on the same day, another CR-42 had come down after an intense dogfight with 3 Hurricanes, during which the pilot's propeller pitch mechanism had jammed. Sergeant Major Antonio Lazzari decided to put it down, accidentally clipping a railway line on his landing run and tearing off his undercarriage. Nevertheless, he was able to make a safe emergency landing, from which he emerged unharmed. Indeed, on this particular raid, the Hurricanes had proved a significant nuisance to the Italians, outclassing the CR-42s and forcing them to focus on themselves, leaving the BR-20s vulnerable. 3 of the BR-20s ended up being downed by the British fighters, alongside 3 of the escorts, to no losses on the RAF side, despite CR-42 pilots claiming they downed 9 Hurricanes, rather optimistically. Simultaneously back in Italy, the British had launched the daring Taranto raid, 21 ferry swordfish attacking the Regia Marina, or Italian Navy, at anchor, ultimately damaging 3 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, and 2 destroyers, as well as inflicting 659 casualties. This prompted Churchill to quip, in reference to the failed Italian raid over Harwich, they might have found better employment defending their fleet at Taranto. A well-publicized joke at the Italians' expense, the CAI's reputation was not the better for it. A further night raid on Harwich the following week was done under the cover of darkness, as all subsequent operations were, and it saw 6 BR-20s targeting the harbour area. Harwich ended up being hit again on the 14th and 22nd of December, though in smaller and smaller raids that ultimately caused little damage. The most significant result of the raid on the 21st of December was a worker in the port losing a leg. No civilians were killed. By this point, the sorties had fizzled out and were losing energy. Formations of 6, 5, even 4 bombers unescorted by fighters. In fact, despite all the preparation, only 2 of the raids were escorted at all, the 2 daylight raids on the 29th of October and the 11th of November. That isn't to say the fighters saw no action by their own, though. On November 23rd, 29 CR-42s of the 18th Gruppo conducted an offensive fighter sweep over Dunkirk, Margate, Eastchurch, Folkestone, and Calais, while 24 G-50s went alongside them. At 11:40 in the morning, 12 Spitfires from 603rd Squadron were scrambled from Hornchurch and flew south to intercept, slotting in behind the Italian fighters before opening fire. Despite the Italians' best efforts, 2 were shot down, with several more damaged, and despite claims of downing at least 5 Spitfires, only 1 was in reality lightly damaged. By the end of December 1940, the CAI had dropped 44.87 tons of bombs on England, with the brunt of the intense fighting having fizzled out months before, and with the weather turning, making sorties less and less frequent. The Battle of Britain had been conclusively won by the British, although large-scale night attacks by the Luftwaffe continued up until May 1941. In early January 1941, the BR-20s and CR-42s were redeployed and withdrawn from their bases in Belgium. The Fiat G50s staying behind and conducting a number of defensive sorties as convoy escorts until April, when they too were withdrawn, later seeing action in Malta and North Africa. Italy's involvement in this iconic campaign is not particularly famous, likely a function of their impact being relatively minimal, arriving after the main fighting had already been done, and of course, underperforming. Nevertheless, it's certainly an interesting chapter in the battle that deserves some coverage, and was a hint in regards to the obsolescence of the types in frontline service with the Regia Aeronautica, even this early in the war. A huge thanks to my patrons on screen now for supporting the channel, and thank you so much for watching this video of Aviation Deep Dive. Consider liking and subscribing for more weekly content, and please also consider supporting us on Patreon. See you in the skies.